Hello and welcome everyone to the Where is God in the Coronavirus World webinar. This is an event hosted by Oxford Big Questions. We're so glad that you're tuning in. It's obviously a really, really big question at the moment. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics from Oxford University. Hi, John. So glad that you're here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be involved in this kind of thing, and hello to everybody who is watching and listening to us this evening.
Great. So I'm just going to explain quickly the format of how this evening is going to run. John's going to give a 20-minute talk, 25-minute talk, just exploring this question for us, unpacking his thoughts on it. And then we're going to go to an interactive Q&A. And there should be a link in the video description. Just click on that, submit your question, and then I'll be fielding the questions to John. Please be asking questions throughout the talk. Think about questions, asking questions as John speaks. He's really wanting to engage with what you guys have to think on what he's saying. Without further ado, John, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've been involved in many webinars and interviews all around the world, of course, in cyberspace in the past couple of weeks. And with my wife, we're locked down just outside Oxford. And let me first say that I really sympathize with students who are locked down at the moment and having difficulty in organizing tutorials and missing all that is so wonderful about university life in Oxford. And it's my hope that this won't get in the way of your eventual degrees and so on. But we're facing a very difficult situation. And because I'm a mathematician and know a little bit about statistics, I could see right at the beginning that this was going to very rapidly, in fact, exponentially, go round the globe. And I thought I would sit down and try to write something, because this is, in one sense, the hardest problem we face, the problem of evil and suffering. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is to give you some ideas that you may want to discuss. So please write your questions while I'm talking. Otherwise, the questions will all concentrate in the last minute of the talk. So write them down as I'm talking, and we'll do our best to say something about them. I say do my best because there are no easy solutions here. But I do believe, and that's why I'm speaking to you tonight, that Christianity has something to say, something very important to say, into the web of complications that are woven by a global pandemic like this. And people are full of uncertainty, full of even fear, job losses, and you know all the problems that are besetting us. So let's have a look at this problem. It seems to me that there are two basic problems and two perspectives to look at them. Firstly, there's the problem of moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. Then there's the problem of what we sometimes call natural evil, although it's an unfortunate phrase. That is where tragedy occurs and there's no obvious human complicity with it. Tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on. That's natural evil. And those two problems face us with very big questions indeed. There's also the fact that they can be linked, because often moral evil, for example, greed, can lead to people, for instance, deforesting a large region of the earth and turning it into a desert. And the end result is that people starve. And so it starts with moral evil, and then it ends up as a disaster. So it is complex. And we see that even with COVID-19, because it is quite possible that they tell us that this virus jumped from animals to human beings. Why did it do that? Well, one widely accepted theory is It's because animals, wild animals that should have been free to roam in their environment, were housed in very cramped conditions that stressed them to such an extent they defecated, and viruses were spread into the air all around them. So it could be that part of the reason it started, at least, was moral evil, people wanting to benefit from this kind of thing. But of course, we're not blaming, in that sense, those people for every death that has sadly ensued in the wake of it. But it is very complicated. Then there are two perspectives. It's one thing to watch on television, as we do, doctors and nurses bravely fighting on the front line to save people's lives and risk their own at the same time. It's another thing to actually suffer from the coronavirus. And so there are intellectual questions we ask, but there are also emotional states that we have to cope with. And one of the reasons I'm a Christian is that I find the person of Jesus Christ so impressive when it comes to sensitivity to people's needs. There's a famous story in the Gospel of John where Jesus raised a man from the dead, but it raises a number of the coronavirus problems. There were two sisters, Mary and Martha. Their brother Lazarus was ill, and they sent a message to Jesus saying, "The one you love is ill." And of course, they expected him to come, but he didn't come. And the man died. And eventually Jesus did come. And the first sister, Martha, met him and said, "If you'd been here, my brother would not have died." And that's one of the problems people raise today. Where is God? We're social distancing. Is God social distancing, or does he just not exist? The interesting thing is the sisters believed in his power to heal, but he didn't come. So was he not willing to heal? And that's a very ancient problem. It's the problem of Epicurus, repeated by David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And it is this statement: Epicurus's questions are not answered. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he's impotent. Or is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? And that echoes down through history. Well, what happened was that Jesus said to this woman, "Your brother will rise again." And they immediately embarked on a fairly high-powered academic discussion about the nature of resurrection at the last day, in which Martha believed. But then she remembered her sister, who was sitting in the house very distraught. And the sister arrived. She said exactly the same words to Jesus: "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." But he didn't embark on a high-powered discussion. She burst into tears. And that's exactly what he did. He wept. And that shows sensitivity, because there are many people out there, you may be one of them, or your relatives or friends or loved ones. And they're not looking for a high-powered discussion and intellectual answers from Oxford students. What they want is a touch or a hug. And it must be awful to have to say goodbye to a loved one without even a hug or a touch, as many people have had to do. So we've got to respond to this in both ways, answering the intellectual questions as best we can with all true humility, because there are no simplistic answers. But secondly, showing that we empathize, that we sympathize. And of course, the answer to their distress then was that Jesus raised a man from the dead. And in a sense, that is what Christianity ultimately has to offer. The man Lazarus died, and so shall we all, inevitably. But the question is there hope beyond death, whether that death comes through a road accident or COVID-19? And I firmly believe there is, which is another reason why I am a Christian, because Christianity, as I see it, competes with no other religion, because it's only here that we find a satisfactory answer to the problem of human death. and to the problem of human relationship with God. So what about our reactions to this? Well, I was in New Zealand just after the earthquake, and I found there were basically three reactions. There were Christians who quoted the Bible and hung on to their trust in God, quoting, for example, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. We will not fear, even though the earth gives way and the mountains fall into the sea, which was what was happening in the earthquake in New Zealand. But then there were other people who said, look, if people are suffering, it is because of their karma, and they're suffering because they haven't behaved. And therefore, you shouldn't really help them, because all you're doing is causing more suffering in a future life. That, to my mind, is an extremely cruel doctrine. But then there are other people who say, look, this is the judgment of God. These people must have been terrible in order to have this inflicted upon them. And people are saying that today. But then another group say, look, isn't it obvious that the solution to this is that there is no God at all? And we should just go with Richard Dawkins, who says the universe is just as we'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no evil, no good, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's, of course, fatalism in its extreme, and it is utterly hopeless. And Richard Dawkins agrees that it's grim, and says that because it's grim, it doesn't mean it's false. And I said, no, but because it's grim, it doesn't mean it's true. We need better evidence than this. Now, I have huge difficulties with the atheist solution. Let me say one or two things first, and you can quiz me later. The first is that it does appear to offer, at least temporarily, an intellectual solution. That is just how it is. Brute fact, the universe is a mess. But secondly, it leaves the suffering. It doesn't alleviate it. In fact, it could be argued to make it worse. Why? Because it is hopeless. There is no hope beyond the grave in atheism. And so there is no ultimate hope to offer to people dying of COVID-19 or anything else. So that's a huge problem for atheism. But my concern is whether it's true or not. And I find it very difficult to square atheism, first of all, with our sense of good and evil. Dostoevsky once said, if there is no God, everything is permitted, by which he meant there's no rational justification for morality if God does not exist. And the odd thing is that atheists will say, look, this is an awful evil, but where do they get the concept from? It seems to me to be to evaporate on the basis of their atheism. So I turn from that and I go back to the hard situation that I'm in, which is I do believe in God, and therefore I have a real problem with this. Now, the problem comes in several forms. First of all, back to David Hume. And we've all argued about this, especially when we're students. Surely a good God would, could, etc., have done this, that, and the other thing. And we argue about God's love and his power, and we never come to any satisfactory solution. Well, as a mathematician, when you're trying to solve a problem and you fail to solve it, especially after a few hundred years, you might wake up to the fact there may be other questions that will lead you further. And the fact is, and I trust you'll agree with me, that all of us, whatever our worldview, are faced with a mixed picture. We see, on the one hand, beauty. I went out the other night, looked through my telescope at the Orion Nebula, spectacular. I come in and I see an intensive care ward with people breathing their last. So it's beauty and it's coronavirus, or as I often say, beauty and barbed wire. That is our world. And no worldview worthy of the name that doesn't accept that can get anywhere. And as a Christian, I accept that. So what do I say about it? Well, I can't solve the problem, the deep philosophical problem, but I can say this, that there's another question, and it's equally hard, that I ask. That question is, granted that we're facing a mixed picture, is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that we could trust with it? Now, that's a hard question, but I believe there is. And it takes me back to the tears that Jesus shed in Bethany 20 centuries ago. They weren't crocodile tears. Jesus was disturbed at what death had done to this little family, but he was going to solve it in an utterly unique way by himself, dying on a cross and rising again. Because our problems aren't simply problems of health, physical or mental. Our problem is that we've been running away from God, many of us, for a long time. And something needs to happen about that. And as we trace the story back, we discover there's an original connection with the introduction of moral evil into the world and the brokenness of the physical creation. Sin, the Bible tells us, introduced human death into the world, thorns and thistles. And there is a sense in which our damaged world is evidencing for us the results of centuries, indeed millennia, of the consequences of sin. And the big question is, what does God do about it? And he does something massive about it. I didn't engineer the whole problem, nor did you. And God doesn't expect me or you to engineer the solution. In Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection, God provides a way where he can forgive us the mess we've made of our own lives and the lives of others, and give us a new life that COVID-19 cannot touch. But I need to say something before I close about the accusation that some people make that this is God's judgment on certain people. Now, we read of plagues in the Bible for which God was responsible, but we need to be careful before we extrapolate that to COVID-19, because as far as I know, there is no directive from God to tell us why COVID-19 happened. Indeed, most viruses are not pathogenic. They are necessary for our lives. Only a few of them are pathogenic. These are the thorns and thistles of which Genesis speaks. There's an incident in the life of Christ that helps us very much to understand what's going on. He was once on the Temple Mountain in Jerusalem, and the people in the crowd said to him, you know, Pilate and his soldiers came here and massacred a group of people while they were worshiping. That's moral evil. And Jesus said an interesting thing. He said, do you think they were worse than anybody else around at the time? And also, he then told them, there was the Tower of Siloam, also in Jerusalem, that collapsed on 18 people and they died. Do you think they were worse sinners than anybody else? I tell you, they were not. Now, this is extremely important because it is a statement by Christ himself that when you see a tragedy, you must not necessarily assume that the people who are victims of it are necessarily worse than anybody else. Now, of course, tragedies can happen directly because of our sin. If I get drunk and crash a car, I could kill myself. But the important thing is we mustn't read into every tragedy the direct judgment of God. Then Jesus said, and gave them a take-home lesson. He said, except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. Now, of course, he didn't mean that they would be massacred or that a tower would fall on them. But what I think he did mean was, when you see tragedy, especially on the scale of a pandemic, it reminds you that we all are going to die. C.S. Lewis once said that pain was God's megaphone to wake us up. And here we are in Europe, which has not even got the word God in its constitution. We've been running away from God for ages. We have stopped thinking about our own mortality. And this pandemic has reminded us that we are extremely vulnerable. We're not in charge. We will all die one way or the other. So in one sense, it acts as a wake-up call, or should act, and make us think of God and eternity. And when people say to me, where is God in a coronavirus world? I'm tempted to say to them, where was he in your world before the coronavirus? Were you looking for him? Have you found him? Because in a coronavirus world, he's in exactly the same place that he was before. He's offering you a great gift if you're prepared to put your trust in him. He's offering you a gift of peace with God, eternal life, forgiveness, and that life will transcend death. COVID-19, as I said earlier, cannot touch it. But the question for all of us is, can we see the evidence that God is trustworthy? That's why the Gospels were written. And I would just say to all of you, you're all intelligent students at Oxford, don't reject Christianity until you have listened to what it says, because nowhere else are you going to find a message that faces you as you are, doesn't pretend that you're any better than you are, but offers you a relationship with God of which you can be certain right now. You see, the problem is that many religions simply give us a set of rules and regulations so that we merit God's acceptance. And this is so widespread that often people think Christianity is just another do-it-yourself, merit-based religion. It is not. We cannot merit God's forgiveness, nor his love. He's prepared to give it, though, absolutely freely if we accept it. And that is the unique thing about the Christian faith. So thank you for listening to me. It's been brief. You can get the book. I think it's cost less than a cup of coffee these days, and it's available in over 20 languages at the moment. And I look forward now to listening to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was really great. The questions are coming in. Can I just remind people that, like, if you've got questions, if you're thinking of them, please just click on the link, send them in. We've already had quite a few typed in already, but it would be great to have a few more. So yeah, I'm just going to kick off with the first question that came in here. And it was about God allowing suffering. And it says, why does God allow one person, like an NHS worker, to suffer for someone else's mistake if the virus was human caused?
Yes, these are deep questions. And the why does God allow bit at the beginning is a question that applies to many things. Why does God allow any of these things to happen? Now, I've no simple answer to this, but I want to step back from it because it's important to think about it. You see, the flip side of it is to say, look, couldn't God have made a world in which things don't go wrong, either on the human level or on the physical level? No moral evil, no natural evil. Wouldn't you love to live in a world like that? Well, maybe you would, but you couldn't because you wouldn't be part of it. What do I mean by that? I mean this, that the most precious thing I think about our lives is our capacity to love, to make relationships with people, our friends and our relatives, our children, our parents. These are the most precious things in life. And you will know that from the friendship that you have made in university. But you see, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, and many others as well, you cannot have the capacity to love without having a certain freedom of choice. And that means that you can choose to say no as well as say yes. Now, my first child, a little girl, I've got 3 plus 10 grandchildren. I remember holding her as I went to the hospital and thinking, you could grow up to reject me. Well, why have children then? Why take the risk? Well, we all know the answer to that, because of the wonderful possibility and potential for that loving relationship. And it's exactly the same at the higher level. God has gifted us with the capacity to say yes or no, to say yes or no to one another, and to say yes or no to Him. And if we say no, we are permitted, allowed, is your word, to experience the consequences of that. And why one dies and another doesn't, in the example you gave, I cannot answer that question. And we shall never know until we see the reverse side of the tapestry. But the important thing is that you and I have to sort out what is our personal relationship to God. We can't see behind what's in other person's hearts. And I meant to say in my talk, I'm going to say it now, that when we try to second guess God and say, oh, God is judging them, be very careful. Because what I've noticed is that when people do that, it doesn't turn anybody to God. It actually turns them on the person who says that. And they get very angry and they say, who are you to arrogate to yourself the moral high ground and think you know what God is doing and who He's judging or not? That's why I'm convinced that what Jesus said in Jerusalem on that day is extremely important. There's no ultimate answer to this kind of thing. We can apply exactly the same question to say, why does that child die in a bus, or why is that person murdered, and so on. The big issue for you and me is that we sort out our relationship to God before we die.
Great. Thank you, John. There's a question that's just come in, which sort of is sort of tackling the whole sort of framework with which you approach this. And it says, why are you assuming there is a universal concept of moral evil? Isn't it just moral evil as Christianity defines it?
Not at all. And thank you for that question. It's a perceptive one. The whole business of the objectivity of evil and good is a very important question. And it's one of the questions that made me, in my old age, or certainly middle age, go and do a degree in bioethics to try and make some sense here. But I think our everyday experience is fascinating. You know, if I suddenly hit you, and I've no intention of doing that, you would probably turn on me and say, why did you do that? You shouldn't do that. Now, in saying that, you expect me to have exactly the same moral standard as yourself. If I simply said, oh, I hit you because I just felt like it, I think this is just the way things are, you wouldn't accept that at all. You'd say, no, you ought. We have all got a sense of oughtness. And from my Christian perspective, this isn't a peculiarly Christian thing. It goes back to our createdness and our constitution, I believe, as moral beings made in the image of God. And our common experience shows us that this is the case. You would find it interesting to read the appendix to a very famous book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man, where he goes around all the philosophies and religions in the world, or many of them, and he finds every single one of them, whether they're pagan philosophies, whether they're theistic, atheistic, pantheistic, the whole lot of them have got the same basic set of moral rules. Now, that's exactly what I would expect. Morality appears to be hardwired because we are made in the image of God. So I don't think, it's anything to do with Christianity as such, but it's to do with the way we're created. We are moral beings, and that in itself, as I said earlier, is a great gift. By the way, I'm trying to keep the answers brief, and if you're not satisfied with them, well, that wouldn't surprise me at all. But if the real questions that you have, you see, the most important thing will be the work you do after we're finished this evening. That's if you're not just asking a question to see how much I know. That's pretty obvious that I don't know everything. But I really encourage you to work on these until you yourself get a satisfactory answer.
Great. Thank you so much, John. We've had a couple of questions talking about choice. So there's one that says, and you talked about it in some of your answers and in your talk, why would God give humanity the choice of ruining his perfect creation? And then another question on a similar vein, which says, you say we need choice to be in a relationship with God, but how can we have choice if all we are is a product of the environment and genetics?
Well, I don't think that is all we are. That's the assumption behind that, is that we're simply a product of the environment and genetics. We are partly a product of the environment and genetics, of course. But on the other hand, the tracing is much more complex than that. And I do believe that ultimately we're in a universe that was thought into existence or spoken into existence by God. And God is ultimately responsible for creating human beings in his image. And that is the huge thing. And it depends on exactly where you start. This is a worldview type question. In other words, if you're an atheist, you'll give one answer to it. If you're like me, a Christian, another answer, a pantheist, another. And what you have to decide is which of those worldviews is actually true. And as you can see, I hope by now, that I believe that the Christian worldview is true. But you say, why would God give you a choice? Well, why do we give children a choice? Why have children if they could choose wrong? And as I suggested, we really know deep down the answer to that, because the flip side of it is so valuable.
Absolutely. Thanks. Just to
Well,
say,
at least I've got one person that agrees with me, but there we are.
yes. Just to say to those of you who are watching and sending in your questions, thank you so much. I'm trying to just get a range of questions on different.
Yeah, that's fine.
So if I missed your question, it's not deliberate. I'm just trying to do a range. But yes, the next question was, you talked in your talk, you mentioned Jesus and Lazarus and that story from the Bible. And there's a question that's come in and it said, if Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, why don't we see people dying from COVID-19 ever rising from the dead today? If, as you say, Jesus is still alive.
That's exactly what those sisters thought. They thought that they believed Jesus had the power because they'd seen evidence of it before in healing people. And what they couldn't understand was the delay, that Christ actually let the man die. And then eventually he raised him from the dead. But they went through all the process of grieving, the heartbreak, and everything else. And I think at least a part suggestion of an answer to your question is that what happened then in microcosm is what will happen on a large scale one day. The mechanism, the way in which Lazarus was raised from the dead, was that Jesus stood outside the tomb and called with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Now, this is in John's gospel. And earlier on in that gospel, Jesus has made the staggering claim that he's going to be the one that operates the resurrection at the last day. And the promise is that if you and I trust him now in this life, even though we die, then we're going to live when he speaks in that day. But he will allow us to die, all of us. And that is simply another reason of making sure that before we die, we sort out our relationship with him.
And as you say, like, we are all going to die, but there are some Christians at the moment, or people who say they're Christians, seen around the world, who say that God's going to protect me. I don't need to follow coronavirus lockdown rules. What do you say to that?
I say they're very foolish. And that isn't Christianity, that's foolhardiness. And I think it's very important for us, even in New Testament days, the Christians lived under the reign of Nero, who was no friendly person by any means. And Paul urged them to pray for the powers that existed and to obey them, so long as they weren't asking something that was morally contradictory or tried to stop them practicing their faith in God. So I think it's our responsibility to be good citizens and to listen to the medical advice and to obey the lockdown. And this notion that God will protect me, I don't need this, is absolute nonsense. I say that because Jesus, I do believe, has the power to heal. He can heal and he does heal, but he doesn't guarantee to do it. And even in the New Testament times, Paul, who clearly had some awful eye disease, and people, when they saw him, some of them were so touched by it, they would said to him, I wish I could pluck my eye out and give it to you. So it must have been something pretty disfiguring and awful. And he prayed to God to remove it. And the answer was, my grace is sufficient for you. So we need to be very careful with this foolhardy notion that God will protect me. And indeed, if I wanted to take that further, I would point out that that's exactly what the devil suggested to Christ when he was tempted in the wilderness. Jump off the top of that tower there, because God will send his angels and protect you. And Christ says, no, no, no. And that's exactly what I say to people that come up with that notion. That isn't trust in God at all. It's simply being foolhardy, defiant. And unfortunately, that kind of attitude can precede an absolutely devastating fall.
Great. Just to let everyone know, we'll continue for about 10 more minutes. So if there's any final questions that you maybe want answered, please just submit them now. We've had a couple more questions on that issue of choice. And I think people are really wanting to hear about that. And someone has said, given that God is omniscient and omnipotent, and that God created us and the entire universe, are our choices really our choices, or are they God's choices? And I believe you maybe written a book similar to this topic, but I'll let you.
I appreciate the question. It's a huge question, and people have wrestled with it for centuries. It's a whole business of determinism or not. And there are two versions of determinism. There's an atheist version with which we may be more familiar. And I gave you an example of it with Dawkins: no good, no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's naturalistic determinism. But then there's theological determinism, which says ultimately God directs everything, he micromanages it, and we have no real choice. Well, I have indeed written a book about it, which is called Determined to Believe, ? And I wrote it because of Oxford students, many of whom asked me this question, and many of whom said to me, I cannot believe in a God like that. And I said, I can't believe in a God like that either. Not only can I not believe in a God like that, I do not think that the Bible reveals God like that. And one of the crucial arguments here seems to me this, that relationship with God determines on whether or not I'm prepared to trust Christ. And Jesus himself, particularly in the Gospel of John, made it absolutely clear that in the end, God's assessment of us is going to depend on whether or not we trusted Christ. Now, just think of the situation. If our choices are not our own, and I come up to the judgment and I'm not a believer, and I say, well, I'm not a believer because you didn't give me the ability to trust Christ. Well, then God becomes a moral monster. I'm sorry to be so blunt about this, but I think there is a huge problem in having that kind of determinism. And then how is there any morality? How is there any love? And I think that view, the deterministic, the robotic view, removes all morality. In answer to a previous question, I could have said, look, God could have made a world in which there were none of these problems. We can make such worlds, virtual worlds or robotic worlds. Robots can't sin in that sense. But who would want a robotic relationship? They're not real because they do not have real capacity to choose. So I think it's very important. But there are so many scriptures that are, in my view, misread concerning this, that I wrote a fairly massive book, I'm afraid. But it's an attempt really to get serious about what the Bible actually says, because you will find, if you care to have a look at it, that a lot of the things that people allege are biblical statements are actually being misread, not simply misinterpreted, but misread. They say nothing of the kind. I'll have to leave that one there, although it's one for a 10-hour discussion, plus coffee.
Yes, we don't have 10 hours right now, but thank you so much. Just to pedal back a bit and go back to the issue of natural evil. This is a question that came in, and it's in two parts. It says, I think you kind of answered the first part, but it says, is all suffering from natural disasters brought on or allowed by God? And then by extension, if that is the case, would that make all of that suffering just?
We live in a world that God created. And because of what I said before, that God has given those choices, in that sense, he has allowed it, but he hasn't commanded it, nor does he directly cause it. That, I believe, is the biblical view. And the question of justice, that's a hugely important one, because if, as I said earlier, and I believe to be the case, I didn't engineer this. My parents were good people, but they weren't perfect. And I'm not perfect, and none of us are. And there's a vast chain going backwards. If I was invited to put all that right, I might protest and say it isn't just. But the whole point about the Christian message is that God has done something that gets us out of that, in the sense that Christ has done something. He is the just one. And he has done something that enables God justly to receive me and forgive me and accept me and give me peace, forgiveness, and eternal life. That is where we see the justice being done. If it were simply the case that God says, right, you sort it out yourself, that is what would be unjust. But that is not the message that he brings to us.
Mm. Okay, so we're wrapping up very shortly, but I think we have time for maybe two more questions, if that's all right, John.
Yeah.
And the first of those two is still on the topic of natural evil. You talked about the idea of moral evil and natural evil somehow being connected, in the sense that when sin came into the world, thorns and thistles. And there's a question here which says, if natural evil is a byproduct of human sin, according to Christianity, how come such diseases existed before humans? For example, cancer in dinosaurs.
I just don't really know. I think that it's an age-old question, this. Couldn't God have made fire that warmed but didn't burn? And that kind of thing leads me to some interesting reflections. Now, I don't have any rigorous answer to your question, but I did reflect on this in New Zealand. Think of earthquakes. What causes earthquakes? Well, tectonic plates. That's the way the earth is built. Now, those tectonic plates move, and that's what causes an earthquake. Now, the interesting thing is that movement is absolutely essential for the oxygen supply in our atmosphere. Without it, we wouldn't live. So here we have the situation where physically the world is built in such a way that we need certain things that are dangerous. Fire is one, electricity is another. And again, I can't second guess what the situation is. That is the way the world is. And it complicates matters. Of course it does. Now, in the case of an earthquake, of course, you can say, well, the mistake is for people to build houses above fault lines. But then for centuries, they hadn't a clue about tectonic plates or fault lines. So you're back in the same difficulty. And in the end, you're faced with my difficult question. Have we enough positive evidence, granted that it's a mixed picture and you've just put another element into it? Have we enough positive evidence to trust God with it? And that's a big ask. I'm well aware of it. But once I consider the alternatives, it seems to me that by far and away, the best way to go is to trust the God who gave himself for us.
Yeah, these are tough questions,
but they're very good questions, and it's good to think hard about them.
Absolutely. So yeah, we'll now have our final question, and it's a very general question, and it touches a lot of what we've been saying. And it says, why should we believe, if we've got this mixed picture, why should we believe that God, if he exists, is the Christian God? Why is the God of the Bible the God that you follow, John?
Well, I have several answers to that, and they're very lengthy, so I got to keep them very short. As a scientist, I see evidence of God in nature. In other words, I see evidence of a designing intelligence in the very fact that we can do mathematics, for example, and it fits with the world and all kinds of things. But you see, why do I believe in the Christian God? That is not something that proceeds from science, but rather from history and experience. And the older I get, the more important it seems to me history is. You have this person, Jesus of Nazareth, who turns up 20 centuries ago claiming to be God, which is a staggering claim. In fact, if it's not true, it's absolutely crazy. But he's had a vast effect on the history of this planet. And it often happens with me like this, that I meet a student, and I've met many in my life because I work with them and among them, and they're distraught about something. Life isn't going well and they're in a mess. And then I meet them 6 months later and I say, what's happened to you? You're radiant. There's something's happened. And they may say something like this, well, I became a Christian, or I trusted Jesus, or I got converted, or something like that. And when you see that dozens and dozens of times, as I have done, you put 2 and 2 together and you make 4. There's something in this business that Jesus Christ, who lived 20 centuries ago on this planet, seems to have a hugely beneficial effect on people who trust him. Now, that would be a reason enough to begin to inquire into the history of it. And you see, one of many of you may be historians. I hope you are, because it's a very important academic discipline. And I just love reading history, because it seems to me that when we look for evidence, we come up with this. Let me focus it down on one, the central claim of Christianity. Jesus claimed to be God incarnate. He claimed that his resurrection, his own resurrection, was evidence for it. Now, did that happen or did it not? Well, various views are put forward. My Jewish friends, and I got many of those, they believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends, and I've got lots of those, they believe that he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose again. Those 3 things cannot be simultaneously true. They are claims about history. And we have ways of getting at history, rational ways. And early on in my life, I wanted to know whether Christianity was true or not. My parents were Christian, but that wasn't enough. And when I got to Cambridge, I perhaps should apologize for that, but I'm not going to because I'm at Oxford now. I decided that the only way to really be sure of these things was to expose them to critical investigation. And I've spent my whole life doing it. And I'll have to shorten this and stop. But if you want to know why I believe, both from the historical side and the experiential side, that Jesus is who he claimed to be, then have a look at the last 2 chapters of my book, Gunning for God, or a shorter book and a more recent one, Can Science Explain Everything? And I'm going to close by saying this. The short answer to your question is, I trust Christ because he offers me something that no other religion offers me. And therefore, it's not arrogance to take from him something that nobody else offers. And what he offers is not a religious program that if I follow it and do my best one day, I just might pass the judgment bar and be accepted. But uniquely, he offers me forgiveness if I'm prepared to trust him now because of what he has done, not because of my merit. That's unique. You'll find it nowhere else. And that seems to me, because it actually works, I've proved it works, not only in my own life, but in my family and hundreds and thousands of other people I've seen. That for me is evidence enough, but you've got to decide it for yourself. You've got to investigate it. And the best way to do is start with the Gospels and ask your critical questions. Try the Gospel of John, for example. But you might find that little book that I wrote not long ago for people just like you, Can Science Explain Everything? Has got sections in it. It's a rapid read that deal with exactly those questions. So thank you very much for listening and inviting me on. And God bless you all. And I hope we're soon out of this lockdown and you're soon busy back in the university library, sweating over your books.
Oh, thank you so much, John. It's been such a pleasure to be hosting you and to have you ask and think about these questions with us. They're really deep questions. Thank you for engaging with all of them with such clarity and such honesty. It's really appreciated. Just a quick thing from me. As you know, this is run by the Oxford Big Questions, and we're part of the Oxford Christian Union. And the Oxford Christian Union is all about Jesus, is all about seeing if Christianity is true. And we run this thing called The Search. And this happens online on Monday evenings via Zoom. And it's basically a place where you can come and you can ask the questions, much like we've done here, except you're in with a group of people and you're discussing them. And it's a great place to explore what the Bible has to say about Jesus, explore more about the message of Christianity. So that's on Mondays at 7:30. It's called The Search Online. Just type it into your Facebooks and it will come up. But yeah, that's all from me. Thank you so much, John. We're going to wrap up there, but thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Good night.